Hi everyone, how are you doing today? This is going to be a bit of a different video. My usual microphone setup isn't accessible right now, so I thought I'd shoot this on my phone because I wanted to share with you my thoughts on Dubliners by James Joyce, which I've been promising for a while now, and wanted to share those thoughts with you before I forget what I thought about the book. And it's quite noisy this evening outside, so sorry for any noise of that nature. Alright, so what is Dubliners? It's a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 short stories that are set in Ireland at the turn of the 20th century. And James Joyce, of course, is a very famous author. He's most well known, I would say, for his big opus Ulysses, and also for The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. And this collection is maybe not as famous as those other two books, but this was the one I decided to read for Ireland, and I think it was a good introduction to Joyce. Basically, these stories focus around characters, people that are just sort of living their everyday lives in Ireland, particularly in the city of Dublin. The first story, for example, here is called The Sisters, and it's about the sisters of this priest who died, but is narrated by this main character, this young man who is kind of going back over his mind, in his mind these memories of this priest. And something to keep in mind about James Joyce is he had a lot of issues with the Catholic Church, so you'll see that a lot in his stories, a lot of tension and maybe some thinly veiled criticism as well. This story wasn't critical so much as it was very mysterious. It builds up a very strange atmosphere right from the beginning. I'll just read this first paragraph here. There was no hope for him this time. It was the third stroke. Night after night I had passed the house. It was vacation time, and studied the lighted square of window. And night after night I had found it lighted in the same way, faintly and evenly. If he was dead, I thought, I would see the reflection of candles on the darkened blind, for I knew that 2 candles must be set at the head of a corpse. And that's actually just half of the paragraph, but it's very immediate. It's not really what I expected from Joyce, maybe because I was subconsciously comparing him to authors like Conrad, who tend to be a bit more wordy and meandering. In this collection, at least, Joyce's style is very immediate, very easy to read, and just, he doesn't really spend too much time in heavy prose, but kind of just immerses you in the scene and the people's emotions that they're going through. So this first story was very strong for me. There's a lot of tension and question about this priest and why did he feel these guilty or unhappy feelings towards the end of his life, and how the people around him don't really know him that well, even though they think they do. It was just a very good opening to this collection. I should note that when I first started reading Dubliners, I was listening to the audiobook read by, what's his name? The guy who plays Moriarty in Sherlock, Andrew Scott. Yeah, he's really good at reading these stories. Of course, he's got the Irish accent that just adds that extra authenticity to the story. So I would highly recommend that audiobook if you are looking for an audiobook. The next story was no less eerie. It's called An Encounter. And it's about these young boys who decide to skip a day of school, and there's some interesting commentary on this. For example, these boys have been reading books or magazines from America, and they're just fascinated by tales of the Wild West and adventures and so on. And so the story almost has this Mark Twainian feel to it as these boys go on this illicit adventure, which is actually rather mundane until they meet this old man who is a very suspicious character, to say the least. And without giving it away, I would say that this story was one that definitely stuck with me. It's not explicit in terms of the content that it's talking about, but I think Joyce is very good at letting you read between the lines, and you can see clearly what's going on in the story. And I think this story was certainly one I won't be forgetting anytime soon. The next one, Araby, not quite as shocking as an encounter. It's just about this boy who falls in love with this girl or has a crush on her and decides to go to this fair called Araby and wants to buy her something at the fair. So very simple story, very charming beginning, but the story kind of builds up to this moment of disappointment at the fair, and really this emotion of disappointment is one that comes up quite often in Dubliners. Disappointment, sort of loss of innocence, and the way that as you're growing up, as you're growing up in this time and place in Dublin, these heavy feelings about your place in life, both in terms of maybe economic standing, but also, the political and the social standing that the Irish had in relation to, say, the English, which is something that comes up a little bit in this story as well. The next story is one that left a big impression on me personally. It's called Eveline, and it's about this woman who is contemplating whether to elope with her boyfriend. And it's actually extremely simple, very short story, just a couple of scenes really. But, she's kind of going back over her life and the sorrows she's endured, the abuses at home, and how she met this guy, and, just all these really mixed feelings. And there's a lot of, obviously a lot of trauma in her life that she's been dealing with and maybe sometimes suppressing. And I don't know, it was deeply impactful and yet very, very simple and short. So I think in this case, one thing that Joyce did was, he kind of juxtaposes the two scenes he's focusing on, the one where she's reminiscing about her past life, and then the moment when she's about to elope with this man. And the second one almost takes on this really surreal quality, this almost ghostly quality. And I won't give anything away, but that's kind of, I guess, where that, I don't know, maybe a little bit more of that modern 20th century style comes into play that you might be expecting from Joyce. Okay, so the next story after that was called After the Race. This one was also very good, but different, quite different from the last three, in the sense that it's about somebody who, his name is Jimmy, I believe, and his father has saved up money for him to go to a college, and I think this college was in England, if I recollect correctly. Cambridge. So already kind of interesting, first of all, that this Irish family has sent their child to England for college. Basically, though, Jimmy gets in with a crowd that is into like car racing, and he has friends from different countries, including France and I think Italy, or I'm not sure, Canada and Hungary. So a very multicultural international crowd here, and there's just a lot of bittersweetness in this story, because obviously he's having a good time with this crowd. They're going to the race, they come back to have dinner, and they're just, getting drunk, they're gambling, and you feel like he's on the brink of just losing everything that his father gave him and that was built up. But Joyce doesn't ever go quite that far. He just sort of paints the scene and these emotions in the character of Jimmy. And he just sort of sticks you in this moment and lets you kind of infer what will happen afterwards. But it was a very good story. It gives you that sense of, the money dynamic and how these different groups interacted with each other, the kinds of people that might tend to stick together. I don't know, but that last scene at the end where you feel like he's going to lose it all, it's just that leaves quite a subtle gut punch, and I would say a lot of these stories have that in them. The next story was not one I particularly liked that much. It's called Two Gallants, or Gallants. And there's not really a lot to say about this one. It's just about these two guys that they're kind of on the fringe of society, and this one guy's kind of interested in asking this prostitute to marry him. But I wouldn't say there wasn't a lot I actually took from this story. Now the next one, The Boarding House, was quite interesting. Again, it's kind of following people that have been through some financial and personal difficulties. It's about this mother, Mrs. Mooney, who has this lodging house, and she's sort of setting up her daughter to get married to one of her lodgers, and it's quite dark in a way. I thought this was a very interesting story because Joyce doesn't just show you one perspective. Like, he also shows you the lodger's perspective, the girl's perspective, and he kind of leaves it in the air as to whether it'll end well or not. But throughout the story, you get this sort of sense of foreboding of catastrophe, really, in this arranged relationship, really, which is not in small part actually financial and economic. So that was kind of ominous. Another story here is A Little Cloud, which is about a man who has a great love for poetry and literature, but he feels this disconnect from his wife, and he has this friend Gallagher who's gone off to London and made a name for himself in journalism, and Gallagher and this guy Chandler, they get together and they talk about their lives and what they've done. And Gallagher's kind of taken on some errors, like he's kind of arrogant and a little bit maybe dismissive of Chandler's life in Dublin. Chandler is married with a child, and Gallagher is off pursuing his career in London. And it's a story about envy, essentially. And this loss of connection with your artistic side. I don't know. I liked the story. I wouldn't say it was profound or anything, but it was one of those kind of day in the life stories that's very well written. Let's see here. The next one is called Counterparts. Oh yes, Counterparts now was really... So, many of the stories after an encounter were kind of, I guess, mild by comparison to that one. Counterparts is where Joyce brings out all the, how should I put it? Counterparts is a real gut punch, and not like a subtle one, like he really hits you. This story is about a man who's a drunkard, but what Joyce does is he builds up a whole sequence of events in this man's day, and how he becomes inebriated throughout the day, how he treats his boss, his co-workers, his wife, and so on. And it's a very dark story, and what really I think makes this one effective is Joyce starts with almost a Dickensian comedic tone, because we're following this man and, you know, how he interacts at the workplace, and it's sort of humorous at first, and then as his frustrations and angst keep building up, and as he continues to have bad luck or bad feelings, you know, after work at the bar or the pub, it just escalates to a really horrible situation. And I think I was talking to this with Blash, who I was reading the story with, and we both thought that this story was very well placed in the collection, like kind of a reminder to you that, you know, Joyce is keeping it very real. He's really not hiding the darker side of life that he's painting here. It might even be worth noting at this point that when this collection first came out, people didn't particularly like it that much, and I wonder if that's just because it might have made them uncomfortable. Like, I don't think Joyce is being all that explicit in these stories, but even just sort of the way he's just painting things the way they are, without getting like graphic about it. I mean, even that just makes you uncomfortable. And if anything, his sort of, again, letting you read between the lines, that's very emotionally impactful. And I can see why maybe people didn't love this collection. It's also, on the whole, very depressing. And, you know, I don't know, but maybe people were not looking for that kind of series at the time. Let's see, the next one is called Clay. This is a story about a young woman who goes on a visit. A very simple story, but very touching. Then that's followed by A Painful Case. And A Painful Case is about this friendship or quasi-relationship between this man and a married woman, and it's quite tragic. This one, I didn't love this one, I think, because it seemed almost, I don't know, I just felt a little too sensational to me, but I don't know. The other thing to note is I think Joyce was pretty young when he wrote this collection. Let's see here. This collection was published in 1914. Joyce was born in 1882, so he would have been 32 when that was published. So still a pretty young guy, and I think you get some of that like quarter-life crisis or coming-of-age angst in this collection, and I think that particular story really shows it. The story after that's called Ivy Day in the Committee Room, and it's just about an election, kind of also about how, you know, there was this Irish hero, but he kind of fell out of favor because he didn't take as strong a stance as he had previously or something, or there's some kind of scandal about him, and then, you know, people are kind of remembering him as this great hero, but maybe he wasn't such a great hero. I think this story just sort of it just sort of drives home this feeling of futility in politics, at least for me. It is very, very specific to this particular figure in the political scene at the time, this Parnell. But yeah, I guess for us modern readers, it's just sort of a reminder that things have always been kind of like that in politics. Disappointing, in other words. Again, that theme of disappointing coming back. Okay, after that story is a story called A Mother, about a woman who is trying to look out for her daughter, but kind of gets a bit heavy-handed in the way that she tries to help her out. I actually really like this story. It's kind of funny, but it's also kind of sad. because it's about this concert this daughter's supposed to perform at, but she's not getting, her mother doesn't think she's getting paid, paid correctly. So there's this whole drama that the mother kind of creates on this point. And I mean, you can kind of see it from both sides, but she gets a bit carried away with how she tries to remedy matters. And it's kind of a tragic comic story. And then a story called Grace. Let's see. Honestly, I didn't really make much of the story called Grace. It's about some men going to a sermon, but I honestly didn't really know what to make of this story. So it may be one I'll have to reread again. And then lastly is The Dead, which is perhaps the most famous story in this collection. I have to admit that I wasn't that impressed by The Dead. It really just sort of rehashes some of the earlier themes and ideas, and it's not written in a particularly, I don't know, to me it's written in a rather pedantic style, more of that typical late Victorian, early Edwardian style, whereas some of the other stories were almost, going a bit beyond that into something more modern. And I'm not saying that style is bad. I'm not saying I enjoy a good Victorian story or Edwardian story, but I wasn't really grabbed by this one. It was okay. It wasn't bad. It just wasn't, it didn't really grab me, I guess, because again, he's kind of going over earlier themes that he's already talked about, whether that's Irish identity and nationalism, whether that's kind of failed relationships or relationships on the rocks, nostalgia, family. Again, though, things he's already covered in earlier stories. So, yeah, The Dead, your mileage may vary, but that is the story that closes the collection. So this went a bit longer than I intended, but I hope that gives you an idea of what Dubliners is like. Personally, I would recommend this. I think I gave it 4 or 5 stars on Goodreads, and I think it's potentially a good introduction to Joyce. Having not read his other works yet, it's hard for me to say if this is a good representation of his work, but it's certainly, for me, it was a good entry point, and as a short story writer, I think he is excellent. So, yeah, that's Dubliners. If you've read it, please let me know what you think, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and I will see you next time.